Hello, everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of Off the Shelf, the podcast where we take books off of our shelves and into our hearts. I'm super excited to be here today with the author of Satellite Love, Genki Ferguson, to dish out a little more on the book and his writing process. I know that social media makes our lives a lot easier in terms of networking and connecting with people we wouldn't otherwise get the chance to, but I'm still kind of in shock that you even heard about my little show. So thank you again so much for offering to be here today. I've never actually done an interview or anything like this before, so this is really new and exciting, and a little bit terrifying. So I hope I don't lose my words or show my nerves too much. To get us started, I was wondering if we might start with a little fast money round type questions, if that sounds okay to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for having me. And it's looking forward to it. There's no pressure whatsoever. It's good to just chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I guess the first thing I'm curious about, even just as a reader, is your writing process. Where do you draw the most inspiration from?
Where do I draw the most inspiration from? I think I'd say from childhood probably. I think most creative impulses, and I'm going to be a bit bold and speak a little bit universally, but I think a lot of us kind of draw our sense of selves, and especially when we're creating what you write or paint or whatever you from your childhood. So for me, I guess most of my inspiration comes from these memories I have. I spent a lot of time as a child in a small city, very similar to Sakura in Satellite Love. And a lot of the characters are people I've known throughout my life. And then other than that, just fiction. Great. I read, I mean, any writer reads a lot. So many authors that I admire, like Ruth Ozeki, or older ones like Yasunari Kawabata or Inoue, and contemporary authors like Murakami too, of course. So yeah, I guess just reading a lot and thinking a lot about when I was a kid.
The book is so vivid, I can really tell that you draw a lot from real life and from your experience. And you mentioned Ruth Ozeki. She did a blurb or a review of the book, didn't she?
Yeah, Ruth Ozeki was kind enough to provide the blurb on the cover of Satellite Love. Ruth Ozeki is brilliant as a person and as an author. She just came out with the Book of Form and Emptiness. I believe it was Time's So Hard. I think it was last year now, late last year. I think it came out in the fall of 2021. And yeah, she's just brilliant. Mm-hmm. As a person as well. I'm very lucky to know her personally, and she's just as compassionate and warm as her writing makes her seem. Yeah, she's it's not really a hidden fact, but she's an ordained Zen Buddhist priest as well. Is kind of the other big thing about her, other than being a globally famous author.
And that's so good to know. Like, I don't know, I love learning little pieces about authors or about famous people. It's so nice to know that they're just people too. So if my limited research was right, you originally conceptualized this story as a film. When did you realize that the story suited a book better than screenwriting?
Yeah, that's true. So I went to Emily Carr University. I studied film there. And I was very ambitious. It was my first year, and I was already planning out my thesis film. And for that, it was the story of Satellite Love. And I think I got 2.5 pages in before I realized that my directing and screenwriting chops weren't quite up to the story that I wanted to write. So I decided to, almost on a whim, people always ask, when did you want to decide to write it as a novel, or when did you decide it was going to become like a full-length thing? And it really just feels like I kind of fell into it. Like I just stumbled into writing a book. So I can't really pinpoint when it happened. All I really know is that it did.
Okay, that's really neat. And so I guess it was like kind of an easier transition than being earlier on. If the process of writing a book can be said to be easy in any way. I don't know. And then, do you have a preference between writing films or books?
Oh, novels, fiction for sure. I mean, I went into film school with the intention of maybe becoming a screenwriter. And then I found the stories I was interested in telling, or at least my own personal strengths, didn't really mesh with screenwriting. Screenwriting is, I think all writers should know how to screenwrite, or at least should take a screenwriting class or read up on screenwriting, because it's a very economical form of storytelling. It's very plot and beat oriented, and you don't have much time or space, and you lose your audience's interest very quickly, which is kind of the opposite of what we're told writing a novel is like, where it's very meandering and introspective. So I think, people who are interested in writing long form fiction or short stories or prose, let's say, uh, knowing how to screenwrite won't hurt you.
That's interesting too, and I think you can really, or at least I found reading, I could really feel the background that you have in film. It was a very visual experience for me in a different way than I think you usually conventionally think of visual in reading books. I would generally think of visual as very descriptive and very like Lord of the Rings, describing every little detail. Not that Lord of the Rings is bad or that describing every little detail is bad, but if you want to read about hills and trees, read Lord of the Rings. It's there for you.
Yeah, I hear that from time to time that I didn't set out to write an overly visual, or I've heard the term cinematic, which isn't a bad, I take that as a great compliment, but it wasn't something I necessarily set out to do. I think that was just a natural byproduct of writing and kind of starting out being trained in film more than fiction.
Yeah, and that's kind of the feeling I got was that it wasn't like physically descriptive, but it was almost like the emotion was visual to me. It was almost tangible. The way you would experience emotion through a film, through expression, or through body language, you managed to do it through words, which is really cool and very unique and skilled style. I don't know if you meant to do it, but you did a good job. Okay, I know this is one of the hardest questions to answer as a reader, but do you have a favorite book? One that's been the most influential or nostalgic or just a favorite?
Do I have a favorite book? That's a tough question. I don't know if I could really specify one favorite novel, but I can definitely give out a couple. The one book that I've loved for a very long time now, and I read it when I was first in high school. And it was kind of my first, I've been reading all my life, but this was the first, like, oh, this is like a very serious work. The first kind of serious novel I felt like I ever read, or rather, really, it's more of a novella or a short story. It's The Counterfeiter by Inoue. Um, and it's a really, really brilliant. I forgot it's referenced in Satellite Love. I think Anna even reads it at one point. But it's a story of two painters, friends. One's a very talented, bright, kind of well capable ink painter, whereas his friend is a genius, and it's kind of this really difficult story of what to do in the face of genius. And the main character is kind of reduced to counterfeiting his friend's work without his friend knowing, in order to make a living, because he knows his friend better than anyone else. I think I read that when I was maybe 16, 17. It had a really deep impact on me. I think it's by Pushkin Press. It's not an easy book to track down all the time, but really, really valuable, especially anyone who's interested in creating art of their own or writing on their own. It's painful in that sense. It's not a happy story, but yeah, I think that's if I had to choose one at this moment, I'd probably mention that.
Okay, I will add that to my list. Now, to move on a little more to the book itself, one of the themes that interested me the most was the theme of loneliness. And I read somewhere a statement from you where you say that loneliness is an inherent part of the human experience. Do you mind going into that a little bit?
Yeah, that sounds like me. That sounds like something I might have said. Especially because I was doing all these interviews like early pandemic when things are pretty rough. But I mean, that is something I believe, yeah. And I think it's maybe kind of this Western idea of loneliness being something to be avoided, or loneliness being kind of negative trait. I mean, loneliness doesn't always feel good, but I think it's an inherent part of humanness, and I think I'd be surprised if there's anyone who's never felt it, but I think you're missing out on a very essential part of being human if you have never felt loneliness, or if you don't have a kind of lonely streak with you, because with that comes introspection, and you're forced to spend a lot of time with yourself. So, and I mean, fiction writing is a very introspective act, which is probably why there's so many books about loneliness, or why it's such a common theme. But yeah, loneliness was definitely something that definitely kind of shaped the way Satellite Love was formed, especially with the way Anna Obata kind of unfolds throughout the story.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting and thought-provoking. And for myself, like, I'm a person who, this is gonna sound sad, but I know loneliness. I think we all can relate to that to an extent. But yeah, over the pandemic, I've just like realized how much I value connections with people, and not getting to really have those has been really hard. And I think it's quite interesting because I feel a lot different about being alone now than I did 2 years ago. I feel like 2 years ago I was a lot more comfortable with spending time alone, and now I think after having it kind of forced on us, it's a lot harder and a lot more uncomfortable for me. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but that's how I feel about it. And I don't know if I enjoy it. Sometimes I really wish I was just more at peace with being alone. But I think the pandemic has kind of made me realize how much I took that social connection for granted, and how much it isn't a given, and how much I need to foster it if I want it to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's definitely a difference between chosen loneliness and loneliness that's forced on you. And I think, especially early pandemic, there's this idea like, oh, we can now all do the things we wanted to do. Everyone can go write that novel or finish that woodworking project or whatever. But exactly. But it's hard to move forward when you don't really have a choice. Loneliness by choice is nice. Let's say it can be an asset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just such an interesting thought. I think to think about, if loneliness is so common, then why is it so uncomfortable? And why is it so hard to get out of or overcome? Or is it something we should overcome?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess at our root, like despite everything I said, humans are very social creatures, and we need each other in order to kind of just make our way through. But yeah, sorry. Loneliness as a choice. Yeah. Sorry. Could you repeat that that initial question?
To be honest, I'm not sure if I can phrase that as a question, or if it's just kind of another thought. I guess what I'm trying to figure out in this thinking about loneliness is just why it's uncomfortable, and why forced loneliness is so much different. And I think something that I've realized too, like I was talking about, is that I think the reason why I value companionship and social life so much more now is that I've realized that being around other people is what makes me feel the most human. And that sounds weird maybe, but over lockdown I really got to the point where I was like, I don't even want to see people. I just want to dress like a blob all the time. I don't want to. But it got really hard and really isolating and really sad. And so I don't know if that's something I should, soul search and be more comfortable with being alone. All I really know is that now I value people a lot more. So maybe all this lockdown was all worth it. Ew, hate to say that. But that's kind of the idea that I got from the book too, is that the time that Anna spends around Leo is the times that she seems the most human, at least to my reading. The scene at the movie theater was so beautiful. Just the way that she lets go and lets loose, and really just, it feels like she's living a normal day in a normal life. Whereas the rest of the book is so much her holding herself in and protecting herself and being so scared to be vulnerable with people.
Yeah, and I guess what it comes down to is the idea that there are different kinds of loneliness, and there are as many ways to cure this loneliness or not, let's say, to approach this loneliness, as there are types of loneliness. So, in Satellite Love, it's a story of gaps. Every single character is missing something, or at least feels as though they're missing something. And the most obvious is that of Anna, who feels isolated and alone, and she kind of solves this by creating a friend by proxy of her imagination. She feels so isolated that her only choice is to go further within herself. And for that, she creates a Leo who maybe by the end of the book becomes something more than just her imagination or not. That's left up for interpretation. But then, the side characters too, you could call them like Soki, for instance. He feels there's a great gap. I mean, visually there's a gap in him. He's missing a tooth, but also he feels this kind of sense of maybe a more existential and less kind of solipsistic loneliness as Anna's. Anna's is very much a kind of a teenager's sense of isolation, whereas Soki is starting to feel more maybe the isolation of being alone, and he's starting to question: are there gods? His father, is a Shinto priest, and he's starting to question his father's faith. And I guess in the same sense that Anna feels abandoned by any parental figure, she doesn't really have anyone. Soki himself feels this kind of abandonment from higher power, if there existed one to begin with. Satellite Love's not a religious book, but it definitely tries to answer all these different facets of loneliness and isolation. And there's also Anna's grandfather too, who's lost himself in time. He doesn't really know when or where, or sometimes even who he really is. Um, and all the characters, even Fumiya, is, from what little we really hear from her, she's not a major character, but there's senses of her own kind of isolation too. If there were to be a book written about her.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I loved all those side characters. I loved all the snippets with Anna's grandfather, and I loved everything about Soki's storyline. I thought he was such an interesting character. Yeah, so something I talked about in my first episode was the fact that if we look back through our history, there are certain tells and characteristics that mark pretty clearly the things that people of that historical age valued and cared about the most. And I find it really interesting to think about the things that will characterize us in 100 years. As much as it pains me to admit, I feel like one of the most standout aspects of our culture will be this kind of age of pandemic and post-pandemic literature, or media in general, films, music, books, everything. There's been this kind of massive societal push to get back to normal, and then the countering side questioning whether our previous normals were sustainable. And part of what I've noticed is that a lot of post-pandemic works really explore whether the return to normal is what we want, if it doesn't also mean a return to ourselves and to each other, and to connection and belief and trust and all the things that make us human. Sorry, I just started talking, didn't stop. I know that's a lot, but do you have any closing thoughts on that? On what will characterize us as a society, and whether something about it will be this questioning what it means to be human in our particular moment.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. And yeah, the pandemic novel. I think a bunch of authors have been rushing out the gate trying to be the one to write the great post-pandemic novel. And I wonder what, you can only find out in time, 50 years from now, what, which one we'll consider to be the great work of the pandemic. But yeah, I've heard sometimes from people saying like, oh, like Satellite Love came out an interesting time where it really kind of resonated with how we're feeling with the pandemic or whatnot. But it's kind of interesting because I wrote it far beyond COVID, way before COVID even started. I mean, the first draft, the 12th draft or whatever, the number really was already well completed, and I'd already, was working with an editor by the time COVID hit. But I think what the real thing with the pandemic was that it didn't really create any new feelings. It just kind of amplified and yeah, it kind of amplified what we already felt in this kind of maybe increasingly alienated and lonely world. I don't think any of the emotions or feelings we felt were really new. It was just more extreme, and it brought to light a lot of the worst parts of ourselves and some of the better parts of ourselves too. But it just kind of put human behavior under a magnifying glass. As for how will the pandemic affect literature in the future, that's a pretty big question. And I don't feel equipped to answer that, but I don't know if we'll necessarily see many novels explicitly about COVID. We'll probably have post-pandemic literature is already happening, and you're seeing different approaches, some that kind of mention it in passing, some that make the pandemic the whole part of their story. I think you'll see, like any major event, you'll see it kind of impact writing and art as a whole in really subtle ways that you don't realize, or ways that maybe even the author doesn't notice. I mean, it's such a massive psyche-altering event across the world, is bound to have ripples. So I guess my answer is that I think it'll be subtler than we think, or at least I think the writing that gets rewarded and will be read will maybe deal with the pandemic indirectly or in ways that we don't even realize at the time. But I do think there'll be there has already been a shift in the way we write.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think we've already seen it, and we will continue to see that shift. And that's really cool to be a part of that, even if it's not the best situation to have created that change. But I guess it's when people aren't trying to write the great pandemic novel that they're gonna do it. So we'll see.
I'm not gonna try. I'm not the guy who's gonna write the pandemic novel. I'll let someone else give it a shot. I'll just write what I write.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today. This has been super insightful and very helpful, I think, for me to have another voice on the other side of the book. And thank you for writing your book. It was really good.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, and it was a pleasure being on your podcast.
Well, thank you so much again to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for listening. Take care until next time, and happy reading. The Off the Shelf podcast is a proud member of the Ordinary Podcasting Network. To learn more about this podcast or the network, please visit ordinarypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Thank you so much, and take care.